Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session today. We're going to be talking about trends in enterprise imaging IT and ways that hospitals and radiology groups can align themselves on IT initiatives. So thanks for tuning in. We'll give everybody a moment or two just to kind of get settled here, and then we'll get started. Just by way of a quick introduction, my name is Reed Humphrey. I'm the Vice President of Technology Consulting for Canopy Partners. We're a radiology IT consulting and services firm and a division of Radiology Partners. We work with hospitals, imaging centers, and radiology practices across the country, helping them to elevate their radiology IT game. So hopefully you'll learn a thing or two on today's session that might be helpful to your organization. So with that, hopefully everybody is settled in, and let's get right to it. So our agenda today will start by reviewing the results of a national imaging IT survey that we've been conducting. It's an active survey that is still in process, but we'll share with you the results we have to date. And we'll talk about some of the key trends that we're learning from that. We'll also discuss the pros and cons of different imaging IT models, hospital PACS versus more of a radiologist controlled PACS. We'll discuss a unified radiology platform and what that means and the benefits and challenges associated with it. We'll talk about AI for a little bit and how to get to yes on AI adoption. And we'll also talk about some just key considerations when making any major IT changes or investments. We'll talk about the value of independent audits or assessments, and then we'll have some closing thoughts and questions. So that's kind of the quick flyover of our agenda. In terms of learning objectives, really four key things. We're going to review the results and key findings from the survey, the Imaging IT survey. We'll discuss the current state of radiology AI. We'll learn the pros and cons of different PACS configurations and some different options as to ways you can kind of think outside of the traditional box there. And we'll explain some key considerations for getting alignment between hospitals and radiology groups on imaging IT initiatives. If you have any questions during the session, please use the Q&A button to submit the questions, and we'll come back and try to address them at the end. I'll give you a couple of more reminders to do that, but again, use the Q&A button in the meeting here to do that. There's also a chat window if you want to chat. I do see a few chats coming in. Let me just see if there's anything there that I need to know as a speaker before I get going. Barry Nielsen says, good afternoon from Wyoming. Hey, Barry, good to hear from you. And I can't see you, but good to connect with you. And Wyoming, that's a long way from where I'm at. I'm in North Carolina today. So, okay, so we're ready to go. And again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button, and we'll get to those in the end. So I want to start by just sharing a quick story with you. This is a story in my local market. I live in Greensboro, North Carolina. And it's a story of how the large health system in the region and the radiology group that they work with have partnered together on some IT initiatives. And it's become a long-term partnership over the last decade. So starting in 2010, the radiology group really wanted to replace dictation or transcription and use automated voice recognition. Not that many groups were doing that at the time, 10, 11 years ago. Certainly not as many as today, but there was a lot of cost tied up in transcription, and the RADs felt like they could do things better by implementing voice recognition. So they invested in their own voice rec system, got it kind of optimized and got everything just the way they wanted. And the hospital saw that system and was like, wow, that's actually really nice. The RAD group was using it for other facilities, not the main hospital. And basically said, you know, could we use that here? And we'd like to replace transcription as well. And we'll just pay you for use of your voice recognition system, because the hospital, you know, was expecting to pay something for that. And it was part of the technical component. Plus it was helping save them a lot of money on labor cost. So the hospital said, we'll pay the RAD group for your voice rec system. Well, that led to down the road, as new IT initiatives came up, the hospital and the RAD group would work together and said, let's figure out what everybody wants in this. What would be a win-win? So a few years later, the PACS came up for replacement. The hospital turned to the RAD group and said, hey, what PACS would you like? why don't you guys go do the research? And you're the radiologists that are going to be using it, have to live with it. So why don't you tell us what you think you want to use? So the RAD group came back, made a recommendation, and even said, if you want, we'll host this thing and we'll manage it and support it, and so you don't have to deal with all the IT burden. And the hospital said, well, that would be great because we're getting ready to put Epic in, and that's going to be a couple of years and a couple $100 million and a lot of resources. So if you guys just can own the PACS and manage that, we'll pay you for it because we got to pay somebody for it. But if you think you can do a good job, we'll let you do that. So now the radiology group is providing the VR and the PACS in that environment. And that led to several other IT initiatives through the years. So now, fast forward 10, 11 years later, and I'll kind of give you a sense of where these two are. But the two organizations in the story, the health system is Cone Health, which is an integrated health network in Greensboro, North Carolina, with 1,200 plus beds, more than 100 locations, and 5 hospitals. The radiology group is Greensboro Radiology, which at the time had about 40 radiologists. Now Greensboro Radiology has grown to 80 plus radiologists, so they've more than doubled in size. And Cone Health has made some acquisitions and grown significantly as well. So the two have grown together and have been very aligned around their IT initiatives, to the point that now there's more than a dozen different imaging IT technologies that they've sort of collaborated on and put in what they felt of best of breed technologies for things like vendor neutral archiving, radiology analytics, advanced visualization, lung cancer screening, and now together they're looking at AI solutions. So really the moral to this story is that things go really well when the hospital and the radiology group work together in truly a collaborative fashion. So what's the point? Obviously radiology is the most technology-centric specialty in healthcare. It influences every other specialty. And with advancements in technology and AI coming rapidly, it's not optimal for the hospital to just be making decisions in a vacuum, or the radiology group to do that. It makes sense for them to consider one another's best interests, not just their own, and work in close collaboration, especially with the fast pace of change in technology. So now we're going to take some time to review an independent imaging IT survey that our team at Canopy has been conducting. We started this at the end of last year. We expect to wrap it up in the summer, and then we'll publish the final results later this year. So we're going to go through some things that we're learning from the survey. So first of all, to date, we have 78 total respondents from 67 different imaging organizations, mostly radiology directors and or practice administrators, so executive level people that have responded. 24 states represented, so good representation across the US. At the bottom here, I've included a link to the survey, and I'll give a reminder of this again in the end. But if you wanted to take the survey, it takes about 10 minutes, and we'll share the results with you in the end if you're interested in some of the things we're talking about today. So anybody who's listening today is more than welcome to participate. In terms of the demographics, we really hit 3 different types of imaging facilities: hospitals, radiology practices, and imaging centers. Try to get a good mix of each. In terms of respondent types, you can see some of the titles and roles of people that have responded so far. And the respondent breakdown is 28 hospitals, 27 RAD practices, and 12 imaging center operations, 67 total respondents. So let's take a look at the first question that we asked. We asked, on a scale from 1 to 5, extremely unsatisfied, to 5 being extremely satisfied, how satisfied are you with the following: your radiology IT vendors, your radiology IT systems, and your IT support for radiologists? In terms of, on a scale from 1 to 5, the lowest ranking was a 3.2 out of 5. And that was for radiology IT vendors. Next up was the radiology IT systems, or the applications, the products themselves, scored a 3.69. and then the support for the radiologist around these applications actually scored the highest. So I think for us, and you can see the breakdown over here on the right of what the breakdown was by hospitals, rad practices, and imaging centers. So one of the biggest takeaways for us was that there seems to be a general lack of dissatisfaction with the vendors, and maybe the lack of communication and coordination among the vendors and the products. And that happens when you've got, half a dozen different hands in the pot, and each vendor is kind of looking out for their respective lane, but they're not necessarily seeing the other lanes and working together across the aisle. And so what happens is, we think that hospitals feel some frustration when the vendors are just kind of looking at their view of the world, but they're not seeing the bigger picture of what the hospital is trying to accomplish, or maybe some of the other interdependencies around this. So that's, we thought this was interesting. Honestly, none of these scores came out particularly high on a 5-point scale, so there's clearly room for improvement. The next question we ask is, in a few words, describe your biggest IT and workflow challenges. The number one challenge was workflow, and the second was technology upgrades, or keeping the systems current, keeping them refreshed, keeping the hardware supported, things like that. And then the third highest was the IT support around the systems. And then the last was standardization, trying to get sort of more of a common pane of glass. So these were in order the biggest IT and workflow challenges. And you can see the breakdown over here as to what some of the specific comments were that people shared. So in terms of technology upgrades, it was upgrading to the latest version of PACS, multiple systems and interfacing them efficiently, and work list upgrade. In the workflow space, which was the number one biggest challenge, it was image sharing, remote reading, interface upgrades, RAD communications, access to relevant prior exams, etc. So you can kind of see, what people were thinking when they responded, with these being their top pain points. We asked, which of the following best describes your reading environment? And the specific question was, who owns the PACS and VR in your reading environment? The results were 62%, or 42 total respondents, or 62% of respondents said that the hospital owns the PACS and VR, and 38% said that the rad practice owns the PACS and VR. So, definitely more often than not, the hospital is kind of in the driver's seat there. But the trend that we're seeing in the market is that rad groups are, really eager to own their own PACS environments, because often they're not just reading for one hospital, they're reading for multiple facilities, and they want a unified reading environment as well. So more and more, the trend seems to be that historically hospitals sort of controlled that environment. And over time, more and more of the radiology groups have been stepping up, making some of their own IT investments, and having more of a seat at the table there. When we think about who should control the environment and own the environment, it helps to look at this in terms of PACS is not just one thing. Actually, there are different components of a PACS system. So if we break that down, there's 5 main components of a PACS. A PACS is a work list, or it can be a work list. Sometimes the work list is driven from the RIS or the EMR, but oftentimes the work list is part of the PACS. So it can be a work list, an enterprise level viewer that covers everything across the enterprise, not just radiology, a diagnostic viewer, which radiologists use, a technologist portal, which is used when images come off the modalities and the radiologists need to get measurements and queue things up before it goes over to the RADs, and then the archive. So when we say PACS, it's not one thing. PACS is actually at least 5 different major components. So one of the things when talking about where can we find alignment and how might we collaborate and minister to each other's best interest is to think about, okay, well, what components of the PACS are we actually talking about? So for example, we would say that for the hospital, more often than not, the hospital should want to be the archive. You need to own the images. You need to be the legal system of record. You want to have control of that data. It just makes sense that the hospital would be the archive or the vendor neutral archive. And probably the technologist portal, because the technologists mostly are employed by the hospital. But the diagnostic viewer is something that the radiologist cared passionately about. This is the tool they use every day to do their job. The same with the work list. So they want a lot of input in that. And it might make sense for the radiology group to just kind of provide the viewer and set it up the way that they want it and optimize it. And then the parties just figure out whatever the financial arrangement is there. And the RADs might be happier in that case. And then the enterprise viewer is usually something that can be driven typically within, if you get the diagnostic viewer, you can also get an enterprise level viewer, or just purchase one separately and then decide, who it makes most sense to own that, probably the hospital in that case. Another thing to think about is not just the components of the PACS, but different ways that the PACS can be configured. These are just a few of the models that we've seen out there in the market, and I'll take a moment to kind of step you through these. So there's the EMR, or risk-driven workflow. This is where the facility has Epic or Cerner or Meditech, and everything just comes straight out of the EMR and feeds the viewer and then is stored in the archive. This is a very streamlined workflow if you can set it up this way. But it puts the work list at the risk level or the EMR level, and is really more under the hospital's control rather than the radiology group's control. So that's an area where you're going to want to have some conversations, because the radiologist really wants to have input, not in the viewer, not just in the viewer, but also in their work list. A full PACS is when, obviously, all the components that I just showed on the previous slide are included. And a deconstructed PACS is when you start to break that up into its respective components. So for example, I had a conversation last week with a large health system in the Northeast that has a risk-driven workflow. So it's coming out of Epic. They have a viewer, and then they have their archive, and those are the three components that they have. And they're currently looking to replace their viewer, but not the rest of it. So you can do that when you have a deconstructed PACS. There's the model where the hospital is just the archive only and lets the RAD group or multiple groups that read for them just handle the whole viewing layer of things. And that's actually a pretty common model. There's the unified work list layer, which is, this is more for, well, it could be for either way, but think of it as a hospital that has 5 disparate PACS systems. And you're not ready to rip them all out and replace them with one. Well, you can lay a unified work list over the top of those 5 PACS systems and have one centralized workflow, manage your service level commitments, track your analytics and things like that with one common work list, while the work list is firing off different PACS systems. So if a RAD is going to read out of Fuji and then they need to go read out of Change or IntelliRAD, they can switch gears, but the work list is sort of the orchestrator or the traffic cop that provides that kind of common layer of which everybody is seeing and doing their work. So that's actually a pretty good solution, kind of I wouldn't say a Band-Aid, but it's a good way to just lay over it if you've got disparate systems, whether you're on the hospital side or on the radiology group side. A PACS overlay is similar to the work list, but this is where, let's say the hospital's got their native PACS and archive, maybe they have a full PACS, but the radiology group also has their own PACS system. And the radiology group wants to be able to reach into the hospital's PACS and get orders and images and studies and prior studies and put reports back in. They can do that with an overlay without either party having to displace their PACS. So the RAD group can use what they prefer to use. The hospital can keep their systems. And with the overlay, you can actually, one can reach into the other, and you can decide what level of access you're willing to share and what kind of data, but it's a good way to kind of find a common ground, is the PACS overlay. And then the last configuration is what we call a URP, or a Unified Radiology Platform. This is where the enterprise has a holistic environment that covers everything, all in one system. So it's not kind of these broken down components, but it's a holistic system, and it goes beyond the PACS. So we'll talk about that here in just a moment, the Unified Radiology Platform. So with all these different configuration options, it's important that the hospital and the RAD group have an open dialogue about which model makes the most sense in their given environment. This really shouldn't be a my way or the highway mindset, which sadly in some organizations they take that approach, but both sides are bringing significant value to the partnership and should be consulted when important decisions on IT are being made. So back to the survey, and I was just talking about a unified reading platform. So we asked the question, do you have a unified reading platform, which in a basic sense is one PACS and one VR across all sites? The hospitals who responded said that 62% do have a unified reading platform. Well, actually, of total respondents, 62% said yes, 38% said no. So there's still a lot of opportunity here where there's fragmentation in the market. If you look at the detailed breakdown of the hospitals, the 28 hospitals that responded, 21 of them said, yes, we have a unified radiology platform, and 7 said no. In the RAD practices, it was about even. And in imaging centers, more of them have this than not. But I would say that's because imaging centers typically kind of control their own ecosystem and can kind of set the terms for how they want their workflow and things to be done and what systems. Whereas, again, the hospitals and the RAD groups a lot of times have to, sometimes can kind of butt heads in terms of who gets what they want. Again, a unified reading environment is more than a PACS. It includes the PACS and all the components that we just talked about, but it also includes voice recognition, maybe some AI, a unified work list, an interface engine to kind of normalize exams coming in and out the door. Think of it, think of a radiology group as reading for 10 sites and they all call a CT head something different. There's got to be something, a layer in place that's translating that when it comes in and then normalizing it to go into the radiologist system so that they know what type of an exam it is. And then on the way back out, the interface engine is translating it on the way back out back into whatever header and footer and format the hospital wants to receive it in. So an interface engine is really a key component to this. And a lot of radiology groups don't have an interface engine. So if they want to be doing more of this type of work, that's something that they probably need to consider making an investment in. And obviously, you've got to have a scalable infrastructure. You got to have a good, sturdy IT backbone that you're running everything on. Whoever's controlling the environment has got to be prepared and fully committed to support it, have the appropriate, security, backup, and redundancies, et cetera, in place. Because this is obviously a mission critical application to keep imaging running. But kind of this is sort of an ideal nirvana state. Realize not every organization has this, but it definitely is nice if you can get to this level. To give you a sense of what life can be like for a radiologist when they're not able to read out of a unified PACS environment or in a highly fragmented environment, coming from the hospital perspective, you may not always realize what it looks like for your RAD groups on the other side, but this is an example. This is an actual client of ours that was, this was their reading room. And this was before they implemented a unified reading environment. So this is what life looked like 3 or 4 years ago. It's a large subspecialized practice with 40 plus rads. And this is what their world looked like. They were reading out of all these different PACS systems, had different VR and transcription in place. And this was just one half of their bunker, their reading room. This is the other half of the room. So literally every station is set up for a different hospital. And they even had a light box over here, which were no longer in use. But all total, there were 6 different PACS with 11 separate instances of VR, plus some transcription at these sites. So from the radiologist perspective, their heads and frankly, their rear ends were on a swivel. If you look at the floor, let me see if I can go back on this a little bit. Just check out that floor, how worn out the floorboard is there from basically just sliding back and forth on a swivel chair. This is how rough it can be for some radiology groups that are trying to accommodate their hospitals. And if a hospital is just not willing to play nicely with them and says, nope, you can only read out of our PACS, our system, can't do anything else, it can make it tough if there's not a partnership here. And frankly, it's not good for patient care. And it leads to physician burnout and dissatisfaction. It also makes it extremely difficult to recruit new radiologists to work in an environment like this. Personally, I'm not a radiologist, but if I was, I probably would not want to work in this environment. So let me go back here. So back to the survey, we asked the question around remote reading. What percentage of your RADs are able to work and read remotely? The split was 65% yes and 35% no. Or actually, it's the other way around in the blue. 35% can read remotely, 65% cannot read remotely. So there's definitely, an opportunity there and a good discussion to be had. I will say that we've seen a significant acceleration of this because of COVID. So these numbers were probably lower in the blue column this time last year, but COVID really accelerated the move to remote reading, especially because hospitals were telling the RADs to stay out of the hospital and stay out of the reading room for a period of time because they were triaging and dealing with COVID cases and trying to deal with a pandemic. And, if you don't absolutely have to be in the hospital, don't come in here. Well, what's a radiologist supposed to do if the only place they can work is in the hospital? So it's really kind of spurred this on to, further adoption in the past year. And I think you'll see this trend continue more towards the ability to do remote reading. The next question we ask is, are you using standard reports templates across all radiologists? 61% said yes, 39% said no. And we asked, do your RADs provide daily or real-time performance feedback on things like their productivity? How many exams do they read? Turnaround times, SLA performance, system workload for unread exams, things like that. And this was almost a 50-50 split. It was a toss-up. 51% said yes, they provide daily or real-time performance feedback. 49% said no. So this is an area where radiology groups need to step up. Hospitals are becoming increasingly more dependent on metrics and data, and radiology groups need to be more sophisticated and provide better reporting and be more accountable. It's no longer good enough to say, well, we've been your local RAD group for 30 years and we're doing a great job. That may have cut it in the past, but it doesn't really cut it anymore. It's a highly competitive market. And if the RAD group isn't providing the data that you need to run your department, I'm sure some other RAD group would be happy to do that. You need to lean on them for this if you're not getting what you need in the area of analytics and reporting. So next slide, we ask, what are the biggest hurdles to adopting investments in imaging IT technology? So there were 3 key things that arose. It was lack of leadership buy-in, the cost and budget approval, which is part of the cost. So lack of leadership buy-in was 20%. The cost, we just don't have the cost, or it's too much, was 25%. And in some cases, they had the money, but getting this formally approved and through the process and contracted had been a challenge for different reasons. There were also 18 other answers to this, but these were the 3 most common ones that people cited. So I'll pause here just as a quick reminder that at the end, we're going to take some Q&A. And if you wouldn't mind using the Q&A box to, if you have any questions as we go, just go ahead and start pre-populating those in the Q&A so that we'll have some in there in the end. That would be great. So feel free to use the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer them in just a bit here. So the next survey question was, how does your organization typically pay for radiology technology applications? What we found is that about 58% typically pay on a CapEx, or a capital purchase expense. And what that looks like is we write the vendor a big check up front, and then we pay them some annual maintenance and support fee to keep it going. And then when the contract's up in 5 years, we write them another big check, or if we want to change to another system. So that's the capital purchase model. 42% of respondents said that they typically pay for these things on an operating expense. And what that would look like is maybe you pay a little bit up front just to kind of get the system implemented, but you're not paying like a big license fee. And then you're just paying as you go based on what you use. So the common model within radiology is a fee per study. And that way it's just kind of scalable based on your volume, whether it goes up or down. So what we're seeing is that historically CapEx was the prevailing model, but over time the operating expense model is becoming more popular. And especially right now, just, cash is in short supply for a lot of hospitals, especially like critical access facilities. And anything that doesn't have to hit the capital budget this year is going to be received a little better than, hey, write us $1 million up front and then pay us for maintenance ongoing. If it can be moved to an operating expense, that seems to be what a lot of facilities are asking for these days. We also asked what percentage of imaging revenues are allocated to radiology IT. This basically broke down as 6%. So think of it as total revenue. So let's say if a facility was doing, for easy math, $100 million a year in revenue, then $6 million or 6% would be allocated toward IT. Roughly the same number was true in hospitals. And again, this is not a percentage of total revenue. This is a percentage of just imaging revenue. So about 6% on IT, but the radiology groups were only about half of that, 3%. And I would suggest that the reason for that is not every radiology group owns their own IT environment and is making the type of investments that hospitals and imaging centers are. Many of them would like to have a seat at the table, but sometimes their hospitals say, no, just use our systems and we don't want you using your systems. So as a result, the radiology groups don't spend as much pound per pound on radiology IT and support because some of them don't have a real robust radiology IT infrastructure. A key insight here, your organization should be prepared to make significant investments in imaging IT and the infrastructure, the systems, and the staff. We're showing the average numbers here from our survey, but some spend as much as 10% of their gross radiology revenues on IT. If you're really looking to be an innovator and drive automation and care coordination and investing in things like artificial intelligence, then you're going to have to spend a little bit more than the average, but hopefully you'll see the payback from that. We also asked about staffing. How many IT employees are dedicated to supporting your radiology department or your facility? What we found is that Imaging centers average about 2.5 people on their staff. Hospitals, 2, but that is because hospitals have a huge IT staff typically, and they can kind of flex as needed for people like infrastructure and security that aren't fully dedicated to radiology IT. And then maybe they have a PACS administrator and someone else that are dedicated. Radiology practice, if they're providing the IT, typically might have more staff people allocated to that, because typically they're serving multiple facilities that they read for, and sometimes there's more complexity with that. In a hospital setting, we typically see that there's one dedicated radiology IT staff person for approximately every 100,000 radiology exams. So if you're a facility with 200,000 annual studies, you might have 2 people dedicated to radiology IT, and so on. That's kind of a good rule of thumb. We asked a very important question here. Do you share data electronically via HL7, orders and results with external entities? 84% of the respondents said yes, which was a little surprising, and 16% said no. And the reason that this is such a critical topic is that some rad groups tell us that their hospitals will share data with other specialties like pathology, surgery, cardiology, even teleradiology groups for nights and weekends coverage, but the hospital won't share data with the daytime rad group. I'm kind of scratching my head as to why that would be, but this seems to be one of the biggest areas of frustration for rad groups when their hospital won't share data and establish an HL7 connection with them. And it presents a giant barrier to IT alignment and collaboration. So, I mean, we fully realize that security is a big concern, and hospitals, want to lock things down. That makes sense. But when hospitals are sharing data and making connections for other specialties, it doesn't really make sense as to why they wouldn't make that available for their radiology group. Also, hospitals, have told us that they don't want to support additional interfaces. They've got 100 interfaces out there, and they don't want to add 10 more to it, which is understandable. So there's some concerns on the hospital side, not just security. But this is exactly the type of conversation that we're talking about here. It's the kind of conversation that true partners have, and they work together to find ways to create a meaningful win-win. So on the topic of data sharing, one of the most important things about data sharing is that you've got to develop, for the hospital perspective, you've got to develop a standard, common way of integrating between your external partners. So, you can't, it's one thing to have a bunch of different interfaces. It's another one when every one of them is a different flavor. That makes it very unwieldy and difficult to support. But if you can come up with sort of a common standard for how interfacing is done, and common rules and protocols of, we'll share this data with you, but this is how this is going to work, and this is how we firewall things off, and this is how you have to connect into us, then it's a lot easier to support when you've got kind of a gold standard for integration. There are some modern ways of doing this now that make integration a little easier to manage and to make it more secure. Some of the sites that we work with are using more DICOM routers to facilitate this, and also FHIR, which is a newer protocol of transmitting data that is very secure, and it also provides more data with the file that's being transferred. So if, to the extent that you're really trying to make sense of the data, you can actually get, more data elements coming through with FHIR. So a few tips there on data sharing. We're just about to close out the survey portion of the discussion here. Toward the end of the survey, we did ask, what are your top IT priorities for the next 12 months? And it broke down, as you see here, with workflow and standardization were the top 2, both of them garnering 30% of the results. technology was 20%, and IT support was 20%. And you can see some of the things, when they said workflow, it was image sharing, remote reading, improving communications with the radiologist, like the actual how we communicate results and incidental findings and things like that, and report them throughout the organization. Standardization, again, standardizing the technology and not having so many disparate systems, multiple systems being combined into one. On the technology side, maybe looking at some new systems or upgrading packs. And then IT support were things like improving network speed. Like, we see some sites that don't even have, 100 meg pipe in terms of, trying to transmit imaging data. And we see others that have a 1 gig pipe connecting information. And obviously things are going to run much faster when you've got bigger bandwidth to do that with. So that's something that a lot of organizations are looking at, especially with now larger files coming through, like tomography type exams require, a lot of horsepower to transmit those things. And then we also have seen a trend in terms of what organizations are investing in. This wasn't in the survey, we didn't ask about this, but one of the things that we've seen that I just wanted to note is there seems to be a greater openness of moving radiology IT off-site than in the past. It used to be that you talk to anybody within the hospital IT and they would say, we want all of our systems in-house. They need to be behind our firewall. We need to hug the servers, and we're putting a moat around everything here, and nothing's going outside of our facility. And over the past few years, technology's gotten better. Cloud platforms have gotten, HIPAA and high-tech compliant and secure, and hospitals and health systems are saying, well, what's mission critical that we absolutely have to host in-house, and what's something that we could potentially source out of house. And so you're seeing kind of this shift moving more in the direction of off-site hosting or cloud hosting. So there's 3 kind of prevailing models out there. The fully on-prem solution, which is the prevailing and traditional model. There's the cloud hosted and fully off-site solution. But there's also hybrid options here where you can have kind of the best of both worlds based on whatever you're most comfortable with. So for example, we're working with a large health system in the Southeast that wanted to own their local archive and PACS and have that reside locally at their house. But they were comfortable with other things like the work list and the voice recognition and certain AI components being done through cloud-based or software as a service type applications, and then connecting into their on-prem PACS. So that's more of a hybrid, kind of the best of both worlds. Lastly, we asked about AI, and we asked the question very specifically, not like who's evaluating AI or who's ever used any AI, but we asked, are your radiologists using deep learning-based AI platforms in production reading? And the answer was 18% said yes, and 82% said no. We hosted a conference 2 years ago, and I asked this question to a room of 150 radiology executives. How many people are actually using AI in live production? And in a room of 150, no one raised their hand. And again, this was 2 years ago, but a lot of people were talking about it. There's a lot of buzz. When you go to RSNA, it seems like everybody and their brother's got AI on their booth. There's a whole room, there was a whole showcase room for AI at the last RSNA. So there's a lot happening there, but we're trying to kind of cut to the quick on this and say, but who's actually using it in a live production environment? And so far, and again, this is a small sample set, but it's only about 18% of the facilities are using it in live production. But I would say if we'd asked the question, are you actively piloting this or evaluating it, the number would be much higher. There's a lot of interest in this. The AI is coming quickly, and you're going to see more and more adoption of this over the next 1 to 3 years. So this graph is going to flip flop here in the near future. So it's definitely, I think AI is ready for its time on the stage, and you'll start to see a lot more use of this. So as I mentioned, from an AI standpoint, it's just like anything else. You've got to work together with your radiologist to figure out what you're going to use, figure out who's going to pay for it, and get them to adopt it, because ultimately the radiologists are the ones that are going to be using this, just like voice recognition and other things. So you can't really jam anything on them. I mean, you can, but it's better to do it collaboratively, and take their input and let them say, we think this will help us clinically. This might provide a good return on investment. But I don't think it's going to be an option to ignore AI. There are some great applications that are getting traction on the market. For example, ADOC is a company that's getting a lot of good market traction and showing some real clinical value and return on investment. And when you combine the best of what a radiologist can do with the best of what machine learning can do, it just makes sense that this is going to improve the overall interpretation, reduce the number of misses and errors, and provide better outcomes. So, the fear of, will AI replace radiologists? No, I don't think AI is going to replace a radiologist. I've heard it said that radiologists who use AI might displace those who don't, but it's not going to replace the role of the radiologist. But one thing we believe that'll catapult the use of AI in radiology is that it's got to be clinically integrated in the workflow. It can't just be a widget that somebody has to remember to go check. It's got to be just seamlessly integrated in the workflow. And to me, that's kind of the next frontier with AI. If you think about the radiology patient flow and all the things that are happening, there are various AI applications that address these different aspects of the imaging workflow, but you can't have 100 different one-off AI widgets. That's untenable. The one that's going to win is the one that comes up with a way to clinically integrate this so that it's just running seamlessly in the background and serving up the right AI for the right type of exam when it's needed. So that concludes the IT survey. We've got about, maybe 10 minutes of additional content, and then we'll take some Q&A here. So again, feel free to use the Q&A session. I see some questions starting to pop in there. All right, so now we're going to take some time to kind of break down the takeaways from the survey. So a few key takeaways. One, make sure that your budget for imaging IT is proportionate to the size and scope of your department. Are you staffed appropriately? Are you making the right investments? Every year, are you sort of looking at the budget and making sure, I can't tell you how many people we talk to that, are still nursing some system they put in place in the late 90s and have hardly made any investments on it. At some point that thing's going to break and you're going to have a very significant unplanned expense on your hands. Either that or you're just going to fall behind and lose any competitive edge and risk some obsolescence in certain areas. So you've got to be making investments in these things. Again, radiology is the most tech savvy specialty within healthcare, and it touches all the other specialties within healthcare. So it definitely needs appropriate care and feeding and budget. The trend of radiology groups owning their own reading environments and having their own unified reading platforms will continue. I think you'll see more and more of that. So hospitals are going to have to learn to work together with the RAD groups and both have a seat at the table. You've got your systems, we've got our systems. How are we going to make these things work together? In some cases, the hospitals are saying, well, if you've got your system, why do I need my system? I bought a PACS for you and a voice rec for you, but if you'd rather use your own, well, then can I just sunset the one that I have? That's a conversation. So a lot of options here. We think you'll see an increase in remote reading. That's just going to continue to rise. Efficient workflow kind of rose to the top as the biggest challenge of radiology IT. So that's something that's constantly got to get worked on and is evolving. As I said, AI is going to become increasingly more important and integrated over the next 3 years. The bottom line is just look for ways to get the radiology groups and hospitals aligned on their IT initiatives. One other nugget here is if you've never had an imaging IT audit or an assessment done, that might be a good idea to bring in an outside firm to just take a look at things and give you sort of an expert third-party opinion on your environment and maybe opportunities for improvement. Typically, that would involve a group coming in and looking at your organization, suggesting best practices, showing key findings and recommendations, presenting that back to your group. And these are some things, just as an example, that could be covered in the scope of an IT assessment. Usually these things are pretty flexible and are, you can kind of direct like, hey, we really want you to focus on X, Y, and Z. And a good consulting organization can flex and really key in on the things that you want them to. But that might be a worthwhile investment to get somebody from the outside to take a look at things. So moving past, kind of taking all this information and thinking ahead of where can we go in terms of working between the hospitals and the radiology groups. It's one thing to talk about ideas and, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we did this? Or what if we put in all these cool AI things? But how do you move past the ideas and the talk and the vision stage to a more purposeful partnership between the organizations? Well, first, it starts with the why. Not, what are we trying to do, but why? What is the goal? What are we trying to accomplish? What are the outcomes? How's this going to benefit the patient? How's it going to benefit the health system? Understand your why before you start asking questions of what and how. The most important question is, well, why do we need to do this and why now? So that to me is a key point when you're thinking about major investments. In terms of the couple of decision points, should we have a PACS-driven workflow or a risk-driven workflow? Which type of configuration? We covered those different configuration options earlier. Should we use a true vendor-neutral archive or just deep traditional storage? Whose VR should we use? Who controls the read stations? Who's responsible for supporting the systems? Is remote reading going to be allowed? What are our security standards? What type of infrastructure is needed? What type of backup and DR are we going to have? And then as you're thinking through those decisions, obviously you've got to bring the right stakeholders to the table. Don't try to go it alone. And it really needs to be a clinically led initiative, not an IT-led initiative. If you're getting to the why is typically for clinical reasons, not for because IT wants a better mousetrap. There's some clinical reason of why we're driving at this. And always keep patient care at the center of every decision. In terms of choosing the right partners, here's a few ideas as to how to, go through a process when you're evaluating new technologies, and a couple things to consider. Who's going to control this? Who's going to own the IT environment and the data? Financial, who pays for this, and what's the fair market value? Compliance, make sure that there's no START violations going on. For example, if the RAD group wanted to provide the PACS, make sure that everything's done above the board and that there's not some backroom deal that's cut here at a below market rate. The workflow, what is it, PACS driven, risk driven, et cetera. Security, obviously hugely important. Who's going to support the system and who's ultimately responsible, whose neck is on the line for the service level agreements and the uptime, downtime, et cetera. And then change management. Anytime you're making a big investment, there's a lot of organizational change going on and the devil's in the details. So you've really got to think through these things. So in closing, I'll just give a quick closing story. I started with a story. One of the largest health systems in the country right now is planning to upgrade their imaging IT environment. They currently have more than 50 RAD groups that read for them. They've got different PACS systems all over the place, as you can imagine. And they're wanting to move forward and have a more modern environment. So they recently sent out a survey to the practice leaders of all the RAD groups that read for them. Again, more than 50 RAD groups. And they said, we want your input and your requirements and your ideas. What would you like to see in a next generation imaging IT environment from us? And what could you potentially bring to the table there to help us with that? So, I really appreciate this system's collaborative nature, because they could certainly dictate terms as large as they are, but they're not doing that. They're trying to do this in a spirit of partnership between the RAD groups that they work with, not trying to force anything. And it's not going to be done as a big bang. It'll be done gradually over time at a pace that makes sense. So that's just one example of a really large health system that is just being very intentional about trying to be a great partner. And that's really what this is all about. It's about trust and relationships. Regardless of your hospital's strategic direction, it makes sense for you to consider partnering with with your radiologist on IT initiatives. And if you approach these conversations in the way that we've discussed, you might be pleasantly surprised at how easy it is to find common ground. So on that note, we're going to conclude our session. Appreciate everyone tuning in. And if you'll stay on the line for a few minutes, I'm happy to answer some questions. And I believe my friend Tom Wall from AHRA is going to help us moderate for a moment or two.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, Tom.
Where am I? Oh, there I am. Good. All right, so we have a couple of questions. So basically, in order to have the flexibility to change the radiologist, do you recommend investing in a VNA to house all of your studies and using the RADS PACS to read?
Again, there's different configurations, so I'm not going to try to write a one-size-fits-all prescription. But yes, I recommend that the hospital have a VNA, not just a PACS archive, but a vendor-neutral archive, because that can take in all kinds of studies, DICOM, non-DICOM, visible light, from across the entire enterprise. So a VNA is, I think, a really excellent solution. And by having that, then it gives you the flexibility, if you so choose, to use the hospital's PACS and have that sync with your VNA.
Okay. So, and when you talk about data, do you mean like images or HL7 information or both? Yeah, that's what somebody had asked.
Yeah, good question. It's actually both. So it's actually, obviously, you've got to be able to pass images to the radiologist, and you've got to be able to get the results back from their reports. But passing relevant data as well, to the extent that you're comfortable sharing it. The RADs, it's helpful for them to be able to see relevant priors, any clinical history that involves this patient, whatever can be shared with them to make a better interpretation. So again, it's what you're comfortable with, but I would say yes, data, images, and reports, but it's got to be tightly secured, to where everybody feels comfortable.
Okay, great. And a couple of questions all combined about AI, which is, what are the real life image interpretation benefits from AI, and who's usually the driver for AI?
Great question. It comes down to, is it a benefit for the RADs or is it a benefit for the health system? There's a lot of AI applications that make RADs more productive, more efficient, maybe help them read faster, things like that. Typically, that's something that the RADs are looking at for their own benefits. But there are also some AI applications that have real clinical care impact on things like intracranial hemorrhaging or pulmonary embolisms, AAAs, things like that, if you can catch these things early in the process and prevent a downstream complication or problem with that patient, it's going to be so much better. So there's kind of a mixed bag of which AI applications are going to benefit more the radiology group or the hospital, and you just kind of have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, great. I think we can squeeze one more in, which is just, I guess somebody had a question about cloud-based VNA, just to explain it a little bit.
Yeah, so Yeah, there's several different types of cloud-based VNA. You can do this through like Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud. I probably wouldn't recommend that for a hospital. That might work for a smaller imaging center or something. But given the security requirements, you got to go with something like really robust and big. And there are cloud-hosted data centers. One, for example, is Radius out of Nashville. They're a radiology-specific data center. All they do is secure cloud-hosted hosting for radiology applications like PACS and VoiceRec and archiving. And they do a great job of that. So there are providers like that that could do cloud hosting. And these are like, tier 3 data centers with, multi-data center configurations. It would meet all the standards that you would need to from a security perspective.
Great. Okay, so we've come to the end. We're only, 1 minute over. I gotta say, I gotta talk quickly so we're not 2 minutes over. Thank you again for a great presentation. It was extremely informative and I'm sure everybody got a lot out of it. So have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. Hope to see you guys in person next time. Take care.
Absolutely. Take care.